So good morning. I'll just make a note about my voice. I've been teaching for the last 2 weeks and I've been going very well, but I'll try my best. I haven't been sick recently, but I've sort of got a long flu sort of symptoms. But as I've said, I've been working and teaching for the last few weeks and it's all been managed well. So hopefully, I'm going well now, so that should work. But thank you, David, for giving me the opportunity to speak today. My title is Christianity and Free Speech, an Uneasy Relationship. And really what I've ended up doing with this presentation and with this research is to explore different parts of Christian history and how the state or society related to the church. As somebody who's mainly been involved in historical research, I'm not going to pretend that, in comparison to others here, that I can give a philosophical or theological argument about Christianity and free speech. What I'm really proposing to do is to look at, in a concrete way, how the state, or perhaps historically the prince or the crown in the past, has related to the state, and to reflect at the end of that on what we can do in a modern sense, because obviously these past episodes are no longer with us. So I'm not proposing in my speech that we return to any particular period, but I do think it's important to understand the way in which Christian societies, when they have existed, normally did not prioritise free expression. And when movements like the Enlightenment and the revolutionary movements of Europe in the 19th century started, they were normally met with hostility and rejection by the Christian churches, particularly the Catholic Church and the state Protestant churches of Europe. And most clergy and bishops and others sided with counter-revolutionary and conservative thinkers in rejecting free expression as being the foundation of society. So that's what I'm going to explore. So I want to begin by going back to the early church to think about the time before the church ever got complicated into a relationship with the state. And in 157 AD, or approximately, St. Justin Martyr addressed the Roman Senate and defended Rome's Christians against the propaganda that had led to their persecution. Justin Martyr accused Urbicus of lying about the early church. Because they didn't worship the gods, they'd been called atheists and impious by the authorities. St. Justin goes to great length, and anyone who's read the first or second apologies of Justin Martyr will know how detailed they are, to defend Christianity. Well, he doesn't use the term Christianity, but the beliefs of the church. He believed that Christians showed great seriousness in their belief by willingly going to their deaths, and he uses that as evidence that their beliefs have a genuine basis. The Roman Empire, like all great empires in the past, had a religious cult built around the emperor and various gods. But it was essentially a free empire that tolerated the religions of most of its subject peoples, and other empires from history, like the Persian Empire and others, were very similar in that. But for those who couldn't acknowledge that the emperor could be divine, like Jews and Christians, they couldn't fit into that otherwise tolerant empire. But Justin Martyr, in his second apology, does not argue that Christians should simply be free to believe and practice their religion without interference. That's not the case that he makes in his apologies, even though we know that Christians at that time are being executed for their beliefs. He instead makes the claim that what Christians believe is the truth, and because it's the truth, they should not be condemned to death or persecuted. So while Rome is known for having this free attitude towards religion, Justin Martyr does not use that fact. He says Christians have been lied about unfairly, and in fact their beliefs are justifiable. Today, many Christians and other religious believers use the principle of free speech when defending their right to speak on moral issues and other things. And that's really important. There's nothing wrong with that. However, what I'm seeking to describe and narrate in this paper is the uneasy relationship between the Christian religion and free speech in history. By outlining that relationship between church and state in the Western world, and I want to specify that I'm focusing on Western Europe and the societies that emerged from that, so Australia, North America, South America, we can divide it up into 4 periods. The first one is Christendom, which lasts the longest, from 313 approximately to 1517, so the Reformation. The second is the period between the Reformation and the French Revolution, so the time that I've labelled, based on some historians, the period of the confessional state. Then the Age of Revolution, where the link between church and state would eventually break down or erode. In all of those periods, the fused church-state lacked a commitment to free expression in the way that we understand it in the modern liberal world. In the Age of Revolution, conceptions of free speech and expression were used by opponents of the European churches to remove their power and unique status in the social order, and as a result, there was deep conflict between the churches and the liberal revolutionary movements. The liberal regimes that emerged in Europe and the wider Western world were often built on a continuing moral and social culture built by Christianity. So for a long time, Christians were very comfortable in those cultures. Many Protestants and in English-speaking countries, Catholics, actually benefited from the liberal order because they were finally actually free to practice their own forms of Christianity without discrimination. But in the last few decades, and this is something which all of our speakers have referenced and will no doubt continue to reference, we know that the liberal secular society has largely lost the underlying Christian culture that it once had. And as a result, the secular progressive world often frames religious beliefs as unsafe and dangerous. And so in response to that, Christians resort to this idea that the public square should be neutral. But we know that that's really not the case. If you say that the public square is free and that religious views are not a legitimate basis for argument, you're essentially creating an irreligious public space. So that hopefully gives us an idea of what I'm addressing. So I'll begin by looking at that period of Christendom. So we mostly would all know, I'm sure, that the Roman Empire became Christian because of Constantine. He gradually tolerated the church and promoted it, and after his death it would eventually become established as the imperial religion. Not only the official imperial religion, but eventually pagan beliefs were suppressed. In his adopted role as protector of the church, Constantine used his power to ensure that the theological divisions in the church were resolved. Despite being an Arian personally, at the First Council of Nicaea, the definition of the Holy Trinity was promulgated. Constantine respected that decision, and he used the power of the empire to punish those who dissented from the council. So as soon as the church went into this relationship with the empire immediately began to enforce orthodoxy to a certain extent. So by the time of the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West, the church was the only legal religion or cult in the empire. The states that would slowly emerge in the following violent centuries in Western Europe would all intimately fuse the church with the state, although it's probably more useful to think of the situation as a fusion between the church and the sovereign. Under Charlemagne, 4 centuries later, the Church and the Empire were deeply linked. Even with the division of his territories after his death, the Church emerged as the only European-wide institution. Amongst the squabbling of emperors and princes, the era between Charlemagne and the Revolution, 700 years later, is rightly called Christendom. Essentially, all people were members of the Church, and the culture of the Church provided a common understanding between the otherwise warring princes of Europe. It truly constituted one civilization. While there are occasionally dissents like the Hussites, and there was always an ever-present Jewish minority. However, full participation in civic life assumed that one was sacramentally a member of a church. The church functioned, perhaps a bad analogy, but almost like an EU-type institution. It was supranational in its nature and practices, whilst it is confusing for those of us who think in terms of the modern nation state. Christendom was a single civilization and system. Perhaps it would be better to think of Christendom as being comparable to ancient China. It's a single civilization. In no sense during this period was there a clear freedom to dissent from the teachings of the Church in public life. In his defence of Christianity in the West, Rodney Stark has argued that medieval institutions in Europe fostered the spirit of inquiry and critical thinking. Stark contrasts this open spirit with the rigid Confucian education system of Chinese civilization, where to reach the top of your field, you had to master the ideas of Confucius. In medieval Europe, you had to propose a new argument in your research. But the medieval universities still had broad parameters. One could not dissent from the defined teachings of the Church. There was no general religious freedom and no recognised right to freedom of speech. Obedience to the Church was seen as necessary both for the salvation of souls and social order. The case of the Hussites is an appropriate example to show the extent of this situation during that period. The Czech priest Jan Hus adopted the ideas of the English reformer John Wycliffe, and he believed that clergy who were corrupt or immoral lost their legitimacy. Operating at that time, in which there were rival papacies in the Catholic Church, Hus was condemned and excommunicated by two papal claimants. He took refuge in Bohemia, the Czech lands, and he requested a hearing at the Council of Constance. Whilst travelling, he was arrested, and the council found him guilty of heresy, and he was executed in 1415. In later years, this would inspire rebellion in the Czech lands. There are two important things to note here. Firstly, it was the Church that tried and punished Jan Hus. Throughout the Middle Ages, the Church was recognised with the competency in the civil order to convict and punish canonical crimes like heresy. Throughout Christendom, the princes were responsible for the enforcement of their own civic sphere, and the Church was left to enforce laws in its own. The Church was therefore a guardian of what could be expressed in the public square, in universities and other places where people gathered in society. Consequently, we can see that during the era of Christendom, the Church in Christendom within Western Europe didn't recognise an uninhibited right to free expression and speech in the social order. In the next period, the confessional state, we come to an end of the time where there was a deep union of culture, language and belief under the authority of the Church in Western Europe. The continent-wide Christian culture fractured under the principles or the pressure of the Reformation. Rather than having a single European-wide cultural order, each European state adopted the not each European state, but many European states adopted the principles of one of the Reformation strands, be it Calvinism or Luther, and had their own fused church states. And it's been described as the era of the confessional state. Places like England and Scandinavia, the new state churches were very much under the authority of the state. So Luther's idea of two kingdoms often led simply to the submission of the church to the king or to the state. Only in Catholic states in Europe did some old understanding of Christendom remain. But even in those countries, the principle of whose region, his religion, which was established at the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, meant that an awareness of the instability of religious belief became clear. If a prince could choose his own religious affiliation and insist that his subjects follow that, why couldn't that principle of religious freedom be extended to his subjects? So questions emerged as to how populations who dissented from the choices of their prince could be dealt with. So there's often, many historians think that there's a link between the absurdity of the prince being able to select his form of reformation, be it Luther or Calvin, or to choose to remain with the Catholic Church and to insist that his subjects do so as well, with the formation of ideas of religious freedom, toleration, and eventually separation of church and state. Toleration was tried with varying success in England, France and Prussia during this time, but probably a good example of how during that era of the confessional state, the understanding of free expression that we have in our modern world was absent is John Calvin's Geneva. So due to Calvinism's influence in North America and in the short-lived Commonwealth of Cromwell in England, the ideas of John Calvin are often identified as being proto-democratic or an early contributor to the development of democratic ideas. There's significant weight to those interpretations because of the Presbyterian governance structure of the Calvinist churches. But while forms of democracy can be attributed to Calvin's branch of Protestantism, ideals of free speech, expression, and a neutral public space cannot be attributed to Calvin. Calvin spent the last 2 decades of his life in Geneva, where he was given the responsibility to draft and implement a constitution for a new church-state relationship that fused religion and the state and placed limits on the free expression of opinion. Calvin insisted on the spiritual independence of the church. In Book 4 of his Institutes of the Christian Religion, he states, "The church is regarded in 2 points of view, as invisible and universal, which is the communion of the saints, and visible and particular. The church is discerned by pure teaching of the word and the lawful administration of the sacraments." So Calvin believed that the church existed throughout the world as a spiritual communion of believers. But communities that adopted his principles of the Reformation did not need to be independent of the state. The Council of Geneva voted to adopt the Reformation principles of Calvin, and he saw ecclesial and civil governments as linked. In his Institutes, he states, "God keeps us united in the fellowship of Christ by means of ecclesial and civil government," unquote. This demonstrates that Calvin recognised, where feasible, that the civil magistrate could play a role in overseeing the church. In Calvin's vision, the civil ruler was the father of his country, and this is a quote, "the guardian of laws and the administrator of justice and the defender of the church," unquote. Consequently, a state that adopted the church model of the Reformation imposed on its ruler a direct role in the governance and protection of the state church and the enforcement of orthodoxy. In Calvin's Geneva, the civil government was used to impose religious and ideological conformity and uniformity on the population. Cases include those of Jerome Bolsec during the lifetime of Calvin, a French theologian who was banished from Geneva for heresy in 1551. His crime was that he challenged Calvin's doctrine of predestination. Another was the example of the execution of Michael Servetus in 1553 for denying the Trinity. So while these are extreme examples, and to be fair, they were very rare, they all provide concrete examples of Calvin's understanding that the state should recognise the church and play a role in enforcing its theology. The idea of executing or banishing dissidents for bad theological ideas would be abhorrent to most or all Christians of whatever stripe. But what is clear, though, is that in the age of the confessional state, the civil order was understood to play a role in regulating the public expression of religious opinion in the public square. As the age of the Reformation segued into the age of revolutions, the question of church-state relations became really important and, in fact, were one of the central issues in those revolutions. In Britain, a limited degree of toleration was eventually granted in 1689 to non-Anglican Protestants, but that toleration did not extend to Catholics. Many of the state's key institutions remained limited to members of the established Anglican Church, such as Parliament and the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. So in these early episodes of toleration, groups might have been given some freedoms, but on the condition that they could not fully participate in civic life and in the social order. France even reversed its toleration of the Huguenot minority under Louis XIV, but that was a rare reversal during the time. Okay. So as we move into the third era that I wanted to talk about, the era of the revolutions. And the French Revolution is really when we begin to see an undermining of all the features of the old regime in Europe, including the role of the church establishment and the promotion of the ideal of religious freedom and expression. In the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, so this is in 1791, the revolution is in 1789, but the declaration came a bit later. The members of the National Assembly of France, so the Revolutionary Assembly, proclaimed that the aim of political association is the preservation of the natural rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, and resistance to oppression. In Christendom and the confessional state era, the state in Western Europe was understood to have a religious as well as materialistic purpose. Later in the Declaration, the right to hold and express one's religious opinions is explicitly recognised. So it says at number 10, no one shall be disquieted on account of his opinion, including his religious views, provided their manifestation does not disturb the public order established by law. And at number 11, the free communication of ideas and opinions is one of the most precious rights of man. Every citizen may, accordingly, speak, write and print with freedom, but shall be responsible for such abuses of this freedom as shall be defined by law." Unquote. So the principle of having one formal religion or church established in a nation or kingdom was completely under threat in the age of the Revolution. In France, one could now write publicly denouncing the doctrines of the Catholic Church for the very first time in the history of the kingdom. They could promote atheism and criticise rulers without fear of the public order being endangered. Whilst established churches would be maintained in most European states in the following 19th century, often the establishment was kept for purely utilitarian reasons. An official religion was often framed, or a state church I should say, was often framed as being helpful for promoting social order and the common good. Such a conception was really prominent in Britain and its colonies, where, particularly in response to the French Revolution, a view was articulated that the main purpose of having a religious establishment was to promote morality and to maintain social order. And the most prominent advocate of this view was Bishop William Warburton from the Georgian era. Protestants and Catholics needed to respond to this revolutionary shift away from having a formal religion of the state and the promotion of free expression. For the most part, the state churches and the Catholic Church initially responded in the 19th century with great hostility to those new developments. And some modern Christians in particular, but everybody, normally ask why that might be the case. Surely if a Christian religion can stand on its own 2 feet, it shouldn't fear the emergence of secular and free societies. Perhaps it was actually better for the church to be free from state influence, and that became a really common argument in North America, as I'll get to. So one school of thought, which de Tocqueville is seen as a particularly representative example, is that liberal orders and societies were actually good for religion and in fact required a pre-existing moral and religious culture to work. And this approach became known as conservative liberalism. And indeed, many dissenting Protestant confessions, like the Baptists, Congregationalists and others, had long rejected the idea that churches should be connected to the state at all, and actually were involved in, particularly in the English-speaking world, promoting the advent of liberalism. And again, as I've said already, in the English-speaking world, Irish Catholics benefited. And in America, one of the common views was that the church benefited from being a free church in a free state. For the most part, however, the Catholic Church in the 19th century and the Protestant churches of Northern Europe were hostile towards the new ways of the revolutions. In the Catholic countries of Europe, the church encountered a revolutionary spirit that completely undermined its ability to function. In Catholic countries, there really wasn't a dispute at this time about where the church sat in relation to the revolutionary ideas and principles of 1789. It was clear that it sat in opposition to them. Whenever liberal regimes came to power in Europe throughout the 19th century, they always sought not only to remove the influence of the church from the state, but also to take church lands and destroy its role in education. In revolutionary France, the religious orders were banned from education. The revolutionaries knew that a state system of education free from church influence was necessary if the ideals of 1789 were to survive. Napoleon normalised relations with the church in his Concordat of 1801. However, the document represented a major shift in church-state relations. The Concordat recognised a special role for the Catholic Church only because it was a religion of the vast majority. The argument was purely practical. He did not recognise his authority as relying on religion or God at all. In the previous era of the confessional states, all monarchs in Europe, Catholic or Protestants, would have regarded the protection and promotion of religion as a part of their role. In states like Austria, and even in South and Central America, in places like Mexico, with its 1857 Republican Constitution, the Church had most of its estates removed and sold to private interests or used for state purposes. In both cases, attempts were made to establish a public and secular basis for education. Surrounded by that hostile ideological climate, the popes of the 19th century expressed firmly the traditional understanding of the special role owed to the Catholic Church in traditionally Catholic states. Pius IX most famously did this when he published his Syllabus of Errors in 1864. The syllabus was a collection of statements criticising the modern world in the prior century. He argued that it was an error to think, and this is from the syllabus, that every man is free to embrace and profess that religion, which guided by the light of reason he shall consider true, unquote. In this he lambasted the liberal regimes of Europe, but also the Catholic thinkers who had advocated the positives of liberal regimes for the Church in Catholic countries, but also in other nations as well. So the view of the Syllabus of Errors is not the only view of Catholic thinkers and clergy from the 19th century, and as many of us will know, the alternative view did re-emerge at the Second Vatican Council in a number of its documents. So I'm not suggesting that the view of Pius IX was the only view about at the time. The Pope went on to state that it was unacceptable for Catholics to accept any system of education disconnected from church control. therefore highlighting that secular or non-sectarian education could never truly be neutral. If religion was not present in an integrated way or present as a purely private or individual matter, Pius IX suggested that students would learn the lesson that religion is not essential to their lives and society. Therefore, education could never really be described as neutral towards religion. Finally, Pius IX directly condemned the core problems of modern liberalism. It is worth listing three of the errors that he listed in full. 77 was, in the present day, it's no longer expedient for the Catholic religion to be held as the only religion of the state, to the exclusion of other forms of worship. Number 78, hence it has been wisely described by law in some Catholic countries that persons coming to reside therein shall enjoy the public exercise of their own peculiar worship. Number 79, moreover, it is false that the civil liberty of every form of worship and the full power given to all of overtly and publicly manifesting any opinions, and this is the free speech part, and whatever thoughts conduce more easily to corrupt the morals and minds of the people and to propagate the pest of indifferentism, unquote. So to look at these statements in more modern terms, what he essentially said is that it's right for the Catholic religion to be recognised as the religion of the state, that non-Catholic religions did not enjoy an unlimited right to worship and practice their own religion freely in Catholic states, and that freedom of religion, speech and expression leads to an attitude that all religions and worldviews are essentially the same on an equal footing, creating a view that leads to indifferentism towards the truth. So while there are many Catholics at the time who felt uncomfortable with the way these ideals were expressed in the syllabus, what is clear if we look throughout the 19th century, that having encountered the principles of modern liberalism and freedom, the leadership of the Church rejected them and sought, at least in Catholic countries, to hold on to its privileged position and act as an arbiter of religious truth and practice. So despite adopting a strong line of defence against modern liberalism and strengthening this line of defence at the First Vatican Council, the next century would see the adoption of a liberal attitude towards the role of the Church, religion in society and free expression in society in most, if not all, of the Catholic countries of Europe and the Western world. So while the Church might have been right in expressing those ideals, it was not successful in having them preserved in any other country, in any particular country. And so that's why perhaps we've seen an attempt or an effort to look more positively at the Christian origins of the Enlightenment and to think differently about the relationship between religion, freedom and the state in the modern Church, by which I mean in the last century. I was going to explore some of the Protestant reactions to the emergence of liberalism in the age of revolutions as well, but I think I might leave that for the paper that I submit, because I know I am running out of time for questions. I was supposed to keep it to 25 minutes, so I will leave that to one side, but what I do look at in that section is the way in which in some Protestant societies there was a hostile reaction to the emergence of the revolutionary liberal movements as well. So I'll leave that to one side because I don't want us to miss out on our lunchtime. So I'll just finish with just a few comments. And as I said at the start, I really just wanted to explore these episodes of the Church's past and to ask the question really is how we respond to this history. Personally, I think that it's important to support the free exploration of ideas in society. While Christians in previous societies rightly sought to preserve the role of the Church in the public life of European countries, in having failed at those efforts, I think we need to recognise that the liberal concept of a neutral public square is not genuinely possible. The reason why so many in the church in the past were hostile towards the revolutionary ideas is because they knew that what was promised by the liberal revolutionaries was not really possible. Okay, if you said all ideas are equally valid, you essentially promote that indifferentist approach. So I think we can argue for free expression without ultimately arguing that it's the best thing. It's good in itself, but it's not the most important principle. So we can argue for it without saying it's the most important principle. I think that our main focus really should be to fight for the rights of church communities to form and adhere to their own principles away from the public square, whilst also saying we should be able to freely express our opinions. So by exploring those 4 episodes from Christian history, I hope I've demonstrated that there is an uneasy relationship between Christianity and free speech, although perhaps the better term is free expression, and the religious nature of the state. So ultimately, I think we need to understand that the concepts of the secular state and the neutral square cannot hide the reality that the state is never neutral on the vision of the common good. And in our trying times, we need a renewed sense of the independence of the church. So I'll leave it there, but thank you for listening.